Amelia's life had always been a bit like a roller coaster, full of ups and downs, but she never complained. She had learned from a young age that life wasn't always going to be easy, especially when you're raised by a single mother who worked day and night to make sure you didn't go to bed hungry. Clara, Amelia's mom, was a widow who did everything she could to give Amelia a better life, even though they lived modestly in a small town. When Amelia was just 5 years old, her father passed away, and Clara took it upon herself to raise her daughter alone. She was tough, like a supermom, and nothing could break her spirit, no matter how hard things got. Amelia worked at a little diner on the edge of town, where the smell of greasy burgers and coffee filled the air. The diner wasn't exactly the dream job, actually, it was far from it. The hours were long, the work was tiring, and the pay was barely enough to buy a week's worth of groceries. But Amelia was determined not to let her mother's hard work go to waste. She smiled through the exhaustion, knowing that her mom had sacrificed so much to raise her. But there was one little problem at the diner. Mr. Gregson, the owner, was a grumpy old man with a temper as fiery as a stove. Every time Amelia made a mistake, even if it was something small, like dropping a plate or forgetting to refill a coffee cup, Mr. Gregson would go into full meltdown mode.
Amelia, how many times do I have to tell you?
He'd bark, causing everyone in the diner to stare. Amelia would just nod, apologizing, and trying to fix whatever disaster had happened, all while secretly wishing she could duct tape Mr. Gregson's mouth shut. But Amelia was no quitter. She refused to let anything break her. However, one day, Clara fell seriously ill. She caught a nasty cold that quickly turned into something worse. Amelia rushed her mother to the doctor, only to be hit with a stack of medical bills that felt taller than a mountain. Clara couldn't work, and Amelia, worried out of her mind, had to figure out how to cover all the bills and keep the house running. The pressure was suffocating. She barely had time to sleep, let alone eat, and she was starting to feel the weight of everything on her shoulders. One evening, after working her shift at the diner, Amelia was sitting in the staff room, scrolling through her phone, trying to find a solution to her financial mess. She needed a miracle, or at least a small miracle. And then, like a gift from above, something caught her eye, an advertisement pinned to the diner's bulletin board. It was bright and bold, with big letters that read,
"Live-in maid needed. Generous pay. Confidential employer."
Amelia's heart skipped a beat. A job that paid well? She couldn't believe her luck. She squinted at the ad again, making sure she hadn't misread it.
Confidential employer,
it said. Amelia's mind started to race. What did that mean? Was this a scam? Or was this the break she had been desperately praying for? She grabbed a pen and jotted down the contact details from the ad, already picturing herself working for some kind of rich, mysterious employer who would save the day and solve all her problems. She imagined the employer being a kind-hearted billionaire who was just looking for someone to take care of their mansion while they traveled the world. Or maybe it was a secret agent who needed a maid to blend in while fighting evil. Amelia laughed at her own imagination, but she knew she had to take a chance. With her mom sick, the bills piling up, and Mr. Gregson breathing down her neck every day, she had nothing to lose. Amelia tucked the note into her pocket and stood up, ready to face whatever came next. If this job turned out to be as good as it seemed, she could finally stop worrying about how to pay for her mom's treatment. Maybe, just maybe, life was about to give her a break. Amelia felt a mixture of hesitation and hope as she stood there, staring at the ad's contact details. She knew she had to try, but the idea of entering someone else's world, a world that seemed to have no place for her, made her nervous. But then again, she didn't have much choice. Her mom needed her, and that was all the motivation she needed. So, with a deep breath, she dialed the number.
Hello.
Hi, I'm calling about the maid job.
Amelia stammered, trying to sound confident, but the words felt foreign in her mouth.
Ah yes, we've been expecting someone. Come by tomorrow at noon.
The voice replied. The next day, Amelia found herself following the directions on her phone, which led her out of town, further than she had ever ventured before. As she approached the address, her eyes grew wide in disbelief. A massive iron gate loomed before her, and beyond it, a sprawling estate stretched as far as she could see. The mansion looked like something straight out of a fairy tale, only this wasn't the kind of fairy tale where the poor girl gets to marry the prince. No, this felt like the kind of fairy tale where the poor girl ends up cleaning every corner of a mansion, sweeping up the glitter and dust of a life she could never imagine. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood before the gates, questioning if she had made a terrible mistake. She could already feel the difference between her life and the world she was about to enter. The gates creaked open, and a stern woman in her 50s, wearing a perfectly pressed black skirt and an apron, appeared.
You must be Amelia.
The woman said in a tone that suggested she wasn't impressed, but wasn't exactly unkind either.
Yes, that's me.
Come inside.
The housekeeper said curtly, waving for Amelia to follow. Inside, Amelia's eyes nearly popped out of her head. The mansion was more like a palace, marble floors, gold-framed portraits, and chandeliers that probably cost more than her entire house. She was led through several hallways, each more luxurious than the last, until they reached a formal sitting room where a silver tray of tea sat on a table.
Sit.
Mrs. Turner, the housekeeper, ordered, as if Amelia was a guest at some royal event, not a potential employee.
I'll be conducting a small test.
Mrs. Turner continued, giving Amelia a cool look as if she already had her judgment made.
I want you to clean a section of this house. If you do well, the job is yours.
Amelia's palms began to sweat. Cleaning a house this big? She could barely keep her tiny apartment tidy, let alone a room the size of her whole kitchen. Still, she had no choice.
Okay.
Amelia replied, forcing a smile. As she worked, Amelia couldn't help but feel like a character in one of those stories where the heroine is way out of her league. She scrubbed, dusted, and polished like her life depended on it, because, well, it kind of did. Each time she thought she was finished, she'd look around and see something else that needed attention. The job was exhausting, but there was something oddly satisfying about making everything gleam and sparkle. By the end of the day, Mrs. Turner reappeared. She surveyed the room, her expression unreadable. Amelia held her breath, hoping she hadn't missed anything. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Turner nodded.
You did well. The job is yours.
Amelia nearly collapsed in relief.
Thank you.
She said, trying to keep her excitement in check. Over the next few days, Amelia settled into the staff quarters. It was small and simple, but it was clean and quiet, a far cry from the chaotic energy of the diner. As she unpacked her things, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of wonder. It wasn't luxury, but it was something she had never experienced before. But as the days passed, she started to notice something strange. The other staff members, housekeepers, cooks, and gardeners, were all very polite, but they had an odd way of acting around each other. It was like they were all on edge, constantly tiptoeing around something. Whenever Amelia tried to engage in casual conversation, they would shift the topic or change the subject entirely.
What do you think of our employer?
She asked one of the maids one evening. The maid just looked over her shoulder, her voice dropping to a whisper.
Best not to ask, dear.
Amelia's curiosity only grew. Who was this mysterious employer? Why was everyone so careful with their words? She had to know more, but she also felt like she was stepping into a world much bigger than herself, one that she was maybe not meant to understand. Days turned into weeks, and though the work was tiring, the pay was enough to ease her worries about her mom's medical bills. Still, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The mysterious employer stayed hidden, their presence never felt in the house. Amelia wondered, was this person real? Or was the employer just a shadow, a legend whispered about behind closed doors. One evening, as the moonlight poured through the tall windows of the grand library, Amelia hummed softly to herself while dusting the endless shelves of books. She was lost in her thoughts, marveling at how anyone could own so many books.
Did I even read all these?
She wondered, shaking her head. The silence of the mansion had become normal to her, almost comforting, but tonight, it felt unusually heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. As she reached for the top shelf, she heard a deep voice from behind her.
I didn't know we had musical entertainment included in the cleaning service.
Startled, Amelia let out a yelp and spun around, her elbow catching a nearby vase. Time seemed to slow as the vase teetered, then fell, shattering into 1,000 pieces on the floor. Her heart sank faster than the vase had fallen.
Oh no.
She gasped, dropping to her knees to pick up the shards.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to.
She froze mid-apology, her eyes locking onto the man standing before her. He was tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. His tailored suit hugged him perfectly, and he carried an air of authority that made her feel like a clumsy child.
I didn't mean to startle you. Are you all right?
Amelia could feel her face heating up.
Yes, I'm fine.
She stammered, quickly gathering the broken pieces into her apron.
I'm so sorry about the vase. It was beautiful. I mean, I'm sure it was beautiful before I ruined it.
He crouched beside her, his movements smooth and deliberate.
Let me help.
For a moment, Amelia couldn't breathe. The sight of this impossibly polished man kneeling on the floor next to her felt like something out of a dream, or maybe a very strange sitcom.
What is happening right now?
She thought, her hands trembling as she picked up another shard.
I didn't know anyone was here.
She managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. He straightened, holding out a hand to help her up. Amelia hesitated for a second before taking it, the warmth of his palm sending a jolt through her arm. Once she was on her feet, she realized just how tall he was, his presence both intimidating and magnetic.
I'm Alexander.
He said simply, his gaze unwavering. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. This was him, the mysterious employer everyone whispered about, the man no one ever saw. She suddenly felt very small, standing there in her plain uniform, holding a handful of broken vase shards.
I'm Amelia. I just started working here recently. I didn't mean to cause any trouble.
It's fine, Amelia. Accidents happen. Just make sure it doesn't happen again.
Before she could respond, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there like a statue. The pieces of the vase in her hands suddenly felt heavier.
What just happened?
She thought, replaying the encounter in her mind. As she finished cleaning up the mess, her mind buzzed with questions. Why did he have to see her like that? Why did he live in such a grand mansion but stay hidden from everyone? And most importantly, why did he have to be so ridiculously good-looking? The days following Amelia's fateful encounter with Alexander were like a roller coaster of challenges, with her heart racing at every unexpected turn. Alexander's sharp eyes seemed to be everywhere, his gaze always watching, always noticing. He had a way of spotting even the smallest flaw, whether it was a dust bunny hiding behind a chair or a crooked picture frame. Amelia couldn't help but feel like she was constantly under a microscope. Every task seemed to carry an unspoken weight, as if anything less than perfection would disappoint him. But, oddly enough, he wasn't cruel. No, Alexander was different. He never yelled, never lashed out like Mr. Gregson at the diner. Instead, his corrections were quiet, measured, as if he was giving her room to improve.
That window.
He said one morning, pointing to a spot she had missed.
You missed the streak. Try using a circular motion next time.
His voice was calm, and though she cringed at her mistake, she couldn't deny that his manner was kind. Yet, kindness didn't mean there weren't moments of pressure. Amelia could feel her pulse quicken every time he walked into a room. She always wanted to be on her best behavior, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being evaluated constantly. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever be good enough to meet his impossible standards. Still, amid the pressure, there were moments of unexpected warmth. One afternoon, Amelia mentioned in passing to another maid that she loved writing stories.
Maybe one day, I'll write a novel.
She had joked, laughing at herself. But the next morning, when she entered her room after a long day's work, a small package was waiting for her on the bedside table. It was a book on creative writing. Amelia stared at it in shock.
How did he even know?
She couldn't help but smile, her heart fluttering with the realization that Alexander had taken the time to remember something she'd said offhandedly. But just as Amelia was starting to feel a little less overwhelmed, things took a turn. One of the other maids, a woman named Carla, seemed to notice the attention Alexander was giving Amelia. At first, Carla didn't say much, but soon, whispers began to circulate through the staff quarters.
Did you hear?
Carla muttered one night, clearly enjoying the drama.
Amelia's got our boss wrapped around her little finger. I heard he's been leaving her gifts.
Amelia's eyes widened.
What? No, he left me a book.
She explained, unsure how to defend herself. But Carla's glare said it all. The rumor mill had already churned into overdrive, and soon, the other staff members started eyeing Amelia with suspicion. It wasn't long before the gossip became more malicious. The tension finally reached a boiling point when an expensive watch went missing from one of the guest rooms. The housekeeper was furious, and accusations flew through the staff like wildfire. Of course, no one had seen anything, but Carla, ever so subtly, made sure that Amelia's name was mentioned.
Amelia's been acting a little too chummy with the boss lately. I'm just saying.
Before Amelia knew it, she was summoned to Alexander's office. Her stomach churned with anxiety. She hadn't taken the watch, she couldn't even fathom stealing from the mansion. Yet, there she was, facing the very man she had tried so hard to impress.
Amelia, I've been made aware of the accusation against you. I'd like you to explain your side.
She stood there, heart racing, trying to keep her composure.
I swear, Mr. Alexander, I didn't take it. I don't even know what happened to it.
He listened intently, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. There was no anger in his eyes, but his silence was heavy, like he was weighing her every word. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded.
I believe you.
Relief washed over her like a cool breeze. Alexander wasted no time in launching an investigation. The mansion's staff was questioned, the rooms were searched, and every nook and cranny was examined. Amelia stayed in the background, trying to stay out of it, but the whispers only grew louder. When the truth finally came out, it was Carla who had stolen the watch. She had taken advantage of the confusion and planted the blame on Amelia, hoping to ruin her chances with Alexander. But Alexander wasn't fooled. He confronted Carla with the evidence, his face like stone.
You should have known better than to test my trust.
Alexander said coldly, his voice leaving no room for argument.
You're dismissed.
The other staff members stood in stunned silence, and Amelia felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. Carla, now thoroughly embarrassed, left the mansion in disgrace, her smugness evaporating in an instant. Amelia, still shaken but thankful, returned to her duties, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. But one thing was clear now, Alexander had a way of doing things that no one else could match. He wasn't just a boss, he was a man of integrity, and his actions spoke louder than any rumors ever could. And for some reason, that made Amelia feel safer. From that day, her respect for Alexander had grown in leaps and bounds, but so had her confusion about him. It wasn't just his integrity that impressed her, it was the layers she began to uncover, the small glimpses of vulnerability that peeked through his otherwise polished exterior. There were moments, like when she saw him sitting alone late at night, his sharp eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. He was a mystery, and the more she saw, the more she wanted to understand him. One evening, she was tasked with delivering fresh linens to his study. She knocked gently before entering, but as soon as she stepped inside, she froze. There was Alexander, standing by the window, his back to her, gazing intently at an old photograph in his hand. The usual intensity in his eyes was replaced by something softer. Something almost sad. For a brief moment, he looked vulnerable, like someone who carried a heavy burden, one he never spoke of. Amelia's heart tugged at the sight, but before she could turn and quietly slip out, he noticed her standing there. He sighed, the sound low and resigned.
You remind me of someone.
He said, his voice quieter than usual. The words hung in the air, and Amelia's curiosity gnawed at her. Who did she remind him of? She wanted to ask, to dig deeper, but something held her back.
I'll leave you to it.
She stammered, awkwardly adjusting the linens in her arms. She quickly made her exit, not daring to linger any longer. But as she walked back to her room, her mind raced.
Who was that person?
She could feel the unanswered question hovering in the air, but she didn't dare push him. After all, she was just an employee. What business did she have prying into his personal life? But that didn't stop her from feeling a sense of connection to him. The lines between employer and employee had become blurry. Amelia found herself thinking about Alexander more than she should. Their interactions, though professional, were laced with moments of warmth. He would occasionally stop by to ask about her day, or sometimes, just offer her a rare smile when she least expected it. It was confusing, to say the least. Was he just being kind, or was there something more to it? One evening Alexander approached her with an unusual request.
You're coming to the charity gala next week.
He said, his tone final as if there was no room for argument. Amelia blinked in surprise.
What? But I can't, I'm just a maid. I mean, I don't even know how to...
You will.
Alexander interrupted smoothly.
I've already made arrangements. You'll wear the gown I had tailored for you.
Amelia's mouth went dry. A gown? For her? It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a fairy tale.
But I don't belong there. I'm just me.
You're more than just you. And I want you there, I insist.
With little room to argue, Amelia reluctantly agreed, though the idea of attending such a high-profile event filled her with dread. She spent the following days agonizing over the outfit and practicing how to carry herself with grace. It wasn't until the night of the gala that she realized just how out of place she felt. When she arrived at the venue, a grand ballroom filled with opulence and shimmering chandeliers, her nerves nearly made her legs give out. But as soon as Alexander saw her, his eyes widened slightly before he hid the reaction behind a composed mask.
Amelia, you look stunning.
She felt her face heat up under his gaze. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, looking every bit the part of a powerful businessman. Yet, there was something different about the way he looked at her tonight, something more personal. It unsettled her, making her heart race in an unfamiliar way. As the evening wore on, she found herself standing awkwardly in a corner, clutching her glass of champagne as if it were a life raft. She felt completely out of her element. The laughter and chatter around her seemed so distant, like she was watching through a foggy glass. Then, unexpectedly, Alexander appeared beside her.
Are you enjoying the evening?
He asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. She shot him a look.
It's overwhelming. I'm not exactly a gala person.
He chuckled, a rare, genuine sound that made her stomach flutter.
You don't have to be. Just enjoy the night.
They talked for a while longer, and Amelia began to feel a little more at ease, though she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was out of place. But then, a fellow guest that knew Alexander and his staff approached them, interrupting their conversation. The man was well-dressed, with a smirk that didn't sit well with Amelia.
Alexander, my old friend. Didn't expect to see you with, well, her tonight.
His eyes swept over Amelia with a dismissive look. Amelia stiffened, and her face flushed with embarrassment. Before she could say anything, Alexander spoke up, his tone cold and sharp.
Watch your words. Amelia's not someone you can speak of like that.
The man faltered for a moment, taken aback by the force of Alexander's response.
I didn't mean it like that.
I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself.
He said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The man, now thoroughly chastised, walked away without another word. Amelia blinked, shocked by the sudden shift in Alexander's demeanor. He turned to her with an apologetic smile.
I'm sorry you had to witness that.
But Amelia couldn't help but feel something stirring inside her. For the first time, she saw Alexander not just as the employer, but as someone who would stand up for her. The night of the gala was a whirlwind, and Amelia felt like she had stepped into a different world, a world filled with glittering chandeliers, sparkling gowns, and men in sharp suits, all gathered in an elegant ballroom. The idea that she was just a maid seemed so distant now. She was surrounded by high-profile guests, none of whom had the slightest clue about her humble background. As the evening unfolded, she found herself smiling, laughing, and pretending to fit in, even though she felt like an imposter. But then, something happened that completely stunned her. Alexander brought her into the middle of the party and introduced her to a group of his friends, not as a maid, but as a guest. Amelia could hardly believe her ears. She blinked at him, then at the group of people who all seemed to look at her as if she were someone they'd been waiting to meet. The shock of it almost made her stumble over her words.
Wait, you're introducing me as a guest?
She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, his usual composure giving way to something softer.
Yes, Amelia, you belong here just as much as anyone else.
She didn't have time to respond before the guests started pulling her into conversation, but she felt a strange flutter in her chest. For the rest of the night, she was treated like someone important, someone worthy of attention. But as the evening wound down, the moment she'd been both dreading and anticipating arrived. Alexander approached her with a warm smile.
Would you care to dance?
He asked, his voice carrying the invitation that made her heart skip a beat. Amelia hesitated, her mind racing with doubt. A dance? She was a maid, not someone who danced at fancy galas. But before she could second-guess herself, Alexander took her hand, his touch gentle yet firm, leading her to the dance floor. As they swayed to the music, the noise of the gala seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the rhythm of their steps and the intensity in his eyes. Amelia couldn't help but feel like she was floating, swept up in the moment. But then, as she looked up at him, she couldn't hold back the question that had been bothering her all night.
Why are you doing this?
She whispered, her voice full of confusion. Alexander's gaze softened as he gazed down at her, his hand resting at the small of her back.
Because you deserve to be seen for who you are, not just what you do.
He replied, his voice steady and sincere. Her heart skipped a beat. She felt both flattered and bewildered. She wasn't used to being seen, not really. People only saw her as the hard-working maid, the girl who cleaned up after everyone else. But here was Alexander, a man with wealth, power, and connections, seeing her as someone more, someone worthy of his time, his attention. The dance ended far too soon, but their connection seemed to linger in the air, undeniable and strong. Amelia tried to push aside the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. Her life was complicated enough without adding a growing attraction to her employer. But the more time she spent with Alexander, the more difficult it became to ignore the chemistry between them. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. Amelia's insecurities clashed with Alexander's world of wealth and privilege, and no matter how kind he was to her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong in his world. She was just a girl who worked hard to make ends meet, not someone who belonged at galas or in the circles Alexander ran in. And then, Clara, her mother, got wind of their growing friendship. When Amelia told her about the gala and her new relationship with Alexander, Clara was less than thrilled. Her protective instincts kicked in, and she warned Amelia to be careful.
He's a rich man, Amelia. What do you really know about him? Don't let him take advantage of you.
Amelia knew her mother was only looking out for her, but the words stung. It hurt that her mother didn't see what she saw in Alexander, the kindness, the encouragement, the subtle moments where he made her feel like more than just a maid. She could see how her mother's fears had clouded her judgment, and it made Amelia question everything. But Alexander, as always, was there when she needed him. He never rushed her, never pushed her beyond what she was comfortable with. His support remained unwavering, even when she doubted herself. It wasn't long before her mother noticed how Alexander's actions spoke louder than any of her worries. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation with her mother, Amelia returned to the estate late. She was exhausted and emotionally drained, but when she walked into the staff quarters, she found a letter waiting for her. It was from Alexander. She opened it with trembling hands, her heart racing as she read his words.
I know it's hard, I know your doubts are loud right now, but I want you to know something. No matter where you come from, no matter your past, you're exactly who you're supposed to be. And I want to be there for you through it all.
Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the letter, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and confusion. Was it really possible that someone like him, someone with everything, could care for someone like her? The answer was right there in the words. It was on a quiet evening, a few days after reading the letter, that Alexander came to find her. He didn't send for her, didn't ask for anything formal, he simply appeared in the doorway, as though he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. Amelia looked up, startled but not surprised. His presence, though silent, always filled the room.
Amelia, there's something I need to tell you.
Alexander said softly, stepping into the room. His voice was different, quieter, as though the weight of his words had finally caught up with him. She frowned, sensing the seriousness in his tone.
What is it?
She asked, her heart beginning to race. She set the letter aside, her attention now entirely on him. Alexander hesitated, as if gathering his thoughts, before sitting beside her. His hands rested on his knees, and he stared out the window for a long moment before turning back to her.
I never told you much about my past, did I?
Amelia shook her head. She had always wondered about the man behind the carefully crafted suit and impeccable manners. What had shaped him into the person he was now? He took a deep breath.
When I was young, my parents passed in an accident. I was left with nothing. No family, no inheritance. I had to build everything from the ground up on my own with nothing but my will and determination and the grace of God. But
his voice faltered for just a second, the raw pain in his words unmistakable.
But it was never enough. I was always chasing something, always trying to prove that I could make it, that I could do something meaningful. And I did. I built an empire, Amelia. But in doing so, I lost parts of myself, the parts that mattered. But you inspire me, Amelia. Your strength, your kindness. You've been through more than anyone should have to go through, and yet, here you are, still fighting, still caring. I need someone like you in my life, someone who reminds me that there's more to life than just success and power.
Amelia's heart swelled, a mix of emotions flooding her. She had always thought she was the one who needed saving, who needed help. But here was Alexander, laying his soul bare before her, showing her that he, too, needed someone to lean on. She didn't know what to say. Words felt insufficient in the face of such honesty. But she didn't have to say anything. Instead, she reached out, placing a hand on his. The gesture spoke more than any words could, conveying her understanding, her acceptance, and her unspoken answer.
I don't know what the future holds.
Amelia said softly, her voice filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope.
But I know that I want to face it with you.
Alexander looked at her, his gaze full of something that made her heart race, a promise, perhaps, or a glimmer of something more.
Me too.
he said quietly, his thumb brushing over her hand. Amelia looked into his eyes, the uncertainty of the past giving way to a quiet hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt ready to face it with Alexander by her side.